You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. Pedram Rowhani, a senior lecturer in Geography and International Development at the University of Sussex in the UK. His work focuses on studying the impacts of climate change on food security, especially in developing countries like Tanzania. I'm very curious to learn more about this increasingly urgent problem and hear about some of the challenges he faces in his work today. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited to learn more about this area of work. It's really been a passion of mine for a long time, and I know that it's becoming increasingly urgent in these economic recessions and all of the tough things going on right now. But before we dive into all of the aspects concerning food security, I'd love to just learn a little bit about you and hear a bit of an introduction, how you got started in this area of work, etc.
Yes, thanks for inviting me. Well, I initially went into university studying engineering and got into engineering and astrophysics. But then I found that a bit daunting thinking about those distances. And during one of my classes, I learned about Earth observation. And this then led me to pursuing a master's and a PhD in using satellite-based Earth observation to analyze environmental processes and environmental change, land use and land cover change. And I was lucky enough to have a very great supervisor, Professor Eric Lombard in Belgium, who opened my eyes to a lot of these issues. And more this idea about the technology of looking at the Earth via satellites, but also what's actually happening on the ground, linking the people and processes on the ground to what's happening, what can be seen with the satellites. And then this then led me to a postdoc career at McGill University with Professor Naveen Ramankurti, where we delved much deeper into these issues about climate impacts on agriculture. And since then, I was lucky enough to get a position at the University of Sussex, and I'm currently a senior lecturer, or as you may call it in North America, an associate professor in geography.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting to hear your balance of, let's say, the technological skills that are required for these kinds of studies, but then also linking that to the application, because I know that's sometimes a challenge to create for many professionals. Regarding that, I thought that first of all, it would be great to just establish kind of a foundation when it comes to studying climate change and food security. Why are these two things linked? What are the kinds of factors that we see that might create challenges, perhaps opportunities, etc.?
Well, that's a big question, and they are very strongly linked because the weather defines what you can grow, but then also what you grow will influence weather and the atmosphere by the emissions and the evapotranspiration that happen. Those interchanges that happen between what's on the ground and the atmosphere happens in both directions. And so that happens with any type of vegetation that we have on the planet. And I got really interested in food because that's obviously something that you and I hopefully consume on a regular basis, and many people. And then I realized that there are a lot of people who do not consume on a regular basis as well, trying to understand those issues as well. But also, if you think about climate, agriculture, the way we produce, the way we consume and everything is also pretty much the main driver of climate change nowadays. So trying to understand that will hopefully help us to come up with solutions as well to tackling both climate change and food insecurity at the same time.
Mm-hmm. When most people think about the connection there, they think about it from, say, climate change causing a drought that influences agriculture, but it's really interesting to see the reverse that the public doesn't often hear about. And regarding some of the regions that are most impacted by climate change, I know you study very particular countries, so I'd love to hear about some of the regions that are most impacted there.
Well, again, I think depends how you define impact as well. Some regions will be positively impacted, right? Where they will enter ecological, ecoclimatical zone that will be more favorable to produce certain crops. The country you're currently in, Canada, or the country I'm currently in, the UK, for the, let's say, short to medium term, we will be beneficiaries of climate change, because you can see it already now here in the UK. There are many more vineyards, for example, cropping up, because it becomes, the temperatures are now higher than they used to be. So it's become more favorable to do so. But then it will be the countries in the tropics or subtropics where they are already on the limits of suitable, temperature or rainfall to grow something. And once we start pushing those beyond those limits, that's where the most negative impacts come from. And it is also mainly these regions that have already a poor access to water for irrigation, or poor access to chemical inputs to strengthen the soils through nutrients and so on. So that will exacerbate the whole process.
And when we think about these challenges for developing countries especially, I know some of your research focuses on Tanzania, right?
Tanzania and Kenya, yeah.
And when we think about these challenges that these countries have, most of the audience is from, say, the US or North America, and it's really hard to envision the types of basic needs that a farmer, say in Tanzania, might have challenges with. And when it comes to food security, I know that it's not just challenges in terms of climate change. Right now, with COVID, there are a bunch of issues with supply chains. There's also been armed conflict in different areas in the past. What are some of these different issues that, kind of on top of climate change, make the problem even worse, but most people wouldn't be aware of them in developed countries?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think also in terms of our current understanding in research, so there's a lot of work on the production side of things. There's some work on the consumption side of things. There's very little in what happens in between the supply chain and all of that. So when it comes to food insecurity as such, I don't think we clearly know the pathways from climate change to somebody not having enough food, or somebody eating too much food. Those pathways. And as you say, there are issues of conflicts that may arise somewhere in between that path, those two extremes. There are issues about migration that may happen, pests and diseases that will come up. Currently in Eastern Africa, you have a massive outbreak of locust invasion, destroying mainly pastures, some of the crops as well. There's a lot of stuff happening, and especially other big challenges that we face by looking at these regions is we have to deal a lot with very small scale farms, subsistence farmers who eat what they grow, who really rely on that. Whereas in Europe or North America and so on, we deal with much larger farms, much more technology. It's more market oriented, and so that imbalance that also exists in terms of research. We're researching North American or Western crops as well, when necessarily not looking into like millet, sorghum, cowpeas, crops that people in those regions rely on. We know much less about that. We have much less access to data on these things. The data that you have may be less reliable, so your results may be a bit shady as well. So there are a lot of problems a lot of challenges when it comes to studying and clearly understanding what's going on.
hmm And then regarding that, I think when you were talking about using technologies like satellite imagery, is it like you're able to get around, say, the challenges of going on the ground, surveying farmers, and going to individual areas, and it's very sparse, to then being able to look at a global picture and then define, say, some key variables that you might be able to look for to measure the health of some kind of agriculture?
Well, I think, again, these things work pretty well in North America, somewhat well here in Western Europe, because the the plot sizes are fairly large, right? And you have also access, the way we are growing food in our regions is more large monoculture. So a big plot of lands that only has one or maybe two crops on it over a year. Whereas if you move again to, areas in sub-Saharan Africa, even areas in Asia as well, you're dealing with very small plots where many different things are grown at the same time or at different times over the year. And so the information that you can pick up with, your satellite images that are currently available for free is very limited. There is a lot of work that a lot of scientists are doing trying to disentangle that, but I'm not sure we have already reached that stage where we can confidently use those products without ever setting foot in those locations.
I think it goes to show the complexity of doing research in these areas now. As this kind of problem intensifies in those regions, it goes to show the kind of selective pressure that might be put on both technological innovations, but also academia and other institutions pushing for this kind of data. And I wonder what kind of changes we might be able to see there in terms of solutions to these problems in the next 5 years.
Something that we're trying to do, and I think that we had a conversation about that yesterday as well, is how to do research that is more useful to the people, the communities, or the countries, or the regions of interest, right? It's easy to sit here in the UK and come up with a problem in my head and I just go ahead and do it. But I think it requires much more of an effort, but it makes it therefore also much more interesting to actually start talking with the people on the ground, understanding what's going on, understanding the processes, understanding the needs or the gaps that needs to be filled, and then to jointly try to figure these things out over a certain period of time. Unfortunately, the way our systems are set up in academia or research, it's very difficult to do. To get money to do this type of stuff, to get time to do this type of things.
Yeah. Do you think that the gap there is with the number of interdisciplinary, not just researchers, but entrepreneurs or government institutions that researchers might be able to connect with a stronger link so that the link between theoretical research on this topic to the people on the ground or the people who are ideating solutions might be able to connect that to a real application more strongly?
Well, yeah, absolutely. In the past, 4 years, I've been working in Kenya a lot, and we've met a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of like scientists, governments and NGOs and so on, a whole variety of stakeholders who are interested in these topics. And we're trying to build together some of this research, but as I said, it takes time. It takes time, it takes effort. It takes the will as well to do that from everybody involved. And it's a whole long-term process. And because I was lucky enough to have some funding to do that, but it's not always that easy to get there.
Yeah. And when you think about these outputs of the research and identifying problems, though there are all of these issues and challenges with getting this kind of data, setting up these experiments, etc., in the first place, when you do think about the problems that have been identified, the issues that developing countries have, what are some of the most high value solutions or interventions when it comes to the day-to-day life of a farmer in a developing country? And how do we make sure that these solutions can get from often the developed world to the developing world?
I would say that's the $5 million question you're asking there. But several of the other issues that I haven't mentioned that also I think needs to be tackled, things around subsidies, policies, the colonial history in those regions and how it has, long-term impacts on the current situation as well, and the power imbalances that this has created both within the country but also between the countries regionally but also globally. All of these things, if you have to take those into account, I think it's a massive challenge. One thing that we've been recently working on a lot, and that was with as I said before, NGOs and government organizations in Kenya, but also local research institutes in Kenya, is to work on the importance of forecasts. So when a farmer comes to the rainy season starts slowly. The farmer, they have their local traditional ways of estimating what the season may or may not look like. And we were then interested to see how we can then add to that the more Western scientific way of providing forecasts, be it forecasts for the rainy season in terms of rainfall. We've been, some of my colleagues have been working on forecasting soil moisture. Here at Sussex, we've been trying to forecast vegetation for 1 or 2 months ahead of time, and how that type of information could potentially help a pastoralist farmer or an agricultural farmer to make then decisions whether they should grow a certain crop or not, whether they should move more into this region for pasture for their livestock, whether they should diversify their crops a bit more, whatever decisions that they need to make at that level. I think those are the more season to season decisions, but then you also then need the more longer term perspective, climate change perspective and things. But that's more the decisions then at the governmental level, policy level, to implement things. But again, whether that happens or not, we see it in our own countries, right? Everybody knows pretty much for the past 30, 40 years that things are going to get bad, and yet nobody's ready to do anything about it. But so that's a whole different problem there. Science has the information now how to convert that into policy.
Yeah, makes me realize the enormous complexity of this kind of work, because even just thinking about it from a micro level, the thing you mentioned about getting more accurate forecasts, everything from doing that in the first place with getting the right data, which you talked about, to then actually getting the results, to then thinking about any social barriers. I know you were talking about a Western idea of how to do things a new way that can sometimes present a barrier in developing countries. Like me, I'm from India. I've seen that kind of thing. But then also on top of that, how do you get the information to them in the first place? And then just thinking about policy and getting stakeholders to work together. Reading your research papers, you just see the result and you would never understand this kind of complexity.
Just to add another level of complexity, you were talking about, how to communicate that. In Kenya, they speak Swahili, and I've learned that there is no Swahili word for probability. So if you want to tell them there's a probability of 65% for whatever in this current season, that doesn't work. You need to work around that and identify other ways of transforming that information into a way that can be understood. If I'm telling you that tomorrow there's a 25% chance of rainfall in Toronto, will you change what you had planned for tomorrow or not? And how do you make those decisions exactly? Now think of that of being your livelihood, and your life depends on it, and then things become even more complicated.
Well, yeah, these kinds of challenges are the things that you'd never hear about except having been on the ground. It goes to show how much work there is to do in this incredible area. So the last question I had for you was, when we look at the future of what's coming next, you were talking about some of the gaps in research or the problems that we still have to tackle. Are there any areas which you think most urgently need attention from academics, from governments, other stakeholders right now?
Well, how policy and all of that can be changed, but also focusing more on the crops that are most important to some communities, or also the soils, taking into account the role that these soils play. So the soils in some regions are very different to the soils here in Europe or in North America. How to collect and gather more reliable and accurate data is important. But also, what I mentioned earlier, understanding these pathways. So what leads to high levels of child mortality, which is usually used as a sad metric of undernutrition. What leads to that? It's really not known empirically. There are a lot of theories around it. And then one final thing, I think one thing that I haven't mentioned a lot, I think, is the role of nutrition. The foods that you and I are eating, or everybody's eating, has certain nutrition levels in them, and how that changes with climate change, how people can have access to decent, nutritious food. At least I don't know a lot about that, but I think it's also, there may be a reason why I may not know.
Yeah, yeah. We actually were talking to an economic historian recently who was talking about recent advances in that you can use nutrition as an indicator of human and economic prosperity. This goes to show how if we have all of these uncertainties, but we're aware of them, it goes to show how much progress there is to be made in the future, how much potential there is in this field. I personally will be very excited to see these developments and potentially perhaps one day work on these developments myself. So I really appreciate you taking the time to outline all of the potential there is here and talk about these key areas that more people need to be focusing on.
Thanks, Madhav, and I hope that I see you soon in future conferences or papers and other research activities.